Okay, I think we'll make a start then. Welcome everyone to this AER Live webinar. It's a free online workshop series from Applied Ecology Resources. My name is Chris Nichols, Conservation Evidence Manager at the Woodland Trust, and I'm delighted to have that you've all joined us today for this workshop to launch the latest issue of our Conservation Science and Practice magazine, Woodwise. Please do check out the Woodland Trust website for back issues of Woodwise and for other science communications coming from the Woodland Trust. I'll also share a link so you can find our Conservation Science and Practice magazine, Woodwise, and also the latest one, which is due to hit the website imminently for this launch webinar. So thanks very much, AER Live, for giving us the opportunity to launch our latest issue of Woodwise, which is all about a nature-positive economy. So firstly, just like to thank our sponsor for today, which is Wildlife Acoustics, who gave us that relaxing nature soundscape we heard just now. Wildlife Acoustics are the leading provider of bioacoustics monitoring technology for biologists, researchers, and government agencies worldwide. You can learn more about their product offerings at wildlifeacoustics.com. So thanks to them. So just before we begin, I'd like to briefly introduce everyone to the Woodland Trust, because we've got a very kind of international audience today, which is great. The Woodland Trust is the largest woodland conservation charity in the UK, managing over 1,000 sites across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. We pride ourselves on being an evidence-led conservation organisation. We identify evidence gaps and priorities relating to our strategic goals, which are to protect, create, and restore predominantly native woods and trees for people and for nature. Our conservation research programme also works hard to communicate the evidence we generate in an accessible way to engage with policymakers, practitioners, academics, and our supporters and our wider stakeholder network, with the aim of ensuring that our research has real impact for people and for nature. So our approach to research to fill these applied evidence gaps has four main strands. We directly fund research, for instance, via our grant call, which you may have seen in the past, and our PhD studentships. We collaborate using our research assets, our sites, our data, our expertise. We actively conduct research on our sites and, for instance, via Research Council funding. And we influence the direction of research through strategic partnerships and networks. We're a proud member of Applied Ecology Resources, and you can find some of our key reports that are permanently archived there on the AER website, things like evidence reviews, etc. So please do check out those and check out the Woodland Trust website as well for other publications, and of course Woodwise that I mentioned a second ago. And I am Chris P. Nichols on Twitter if you want to follow me. So just also to mention that we're delighted to announce that you can still sign up for our upcoming in-person symposium, jointly organised with the British Ecological Society and University of Kent. If you're quick, registration closes tomorrow, which is Friday the 16th of June at 5 p.m. UK time. So please visit the BES website after today's workshop if you'd like to be part of the conversation and join us for, we're very proud that that's kind of the Woodland Trust's first big symposium. So please do join us. The two-day event will bring together academics, policymakers, practitioners, and we'll be exploring the restoration and expansion of wooded habitats, taking a transdisciplinary standpoint. And so I hope to see you there. So for today's webinar, I'll shortly hand over to our speakers for today's workshop, but before I do, a few housekeeping rules. The workshop will be recorded and posted online, so please keep your camera and audio off at all times unless asked otherwise. Please send in any questions or comments for the speakers via the Zoom chat box, and we'll be posing these to the speakers during the Q&A section of the workshop. The AER team are also on hand to address any technical issues if you share them via the chat, but hopefully we'll have a smooth running webinar today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Heather, who is our first speaker from the Woodland Trust. Thanks very much, Heather.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon to share some thoughts and be part of this webinar to explore this fast-growing concept, narrative, goal of nature-positive economy. So maybe this is something you've come across lots already. Maybe you're already using this language. Maybe you have no idea what it means and you just want to learn more. So we thought it would be really interesting to start with a bit of a poll. This is new language, so we thought it'd be really interesting. What does this mean? What does nature positive economy mean to you? There are no wrong answers. Does it mean nothing? Is it really exciting? Is it terrifying? We'd be very interested to find out. So while we wait for your answers, and we'll come back to that a bit later. So hopefully that works in terms of the instructions. So you join there, the Menti, and then use that code. So I'll come back to that. If I just reshare my screen. So yeah, while you look at that Menti poll, so as Chris mentioned, yeah, this webinar is coinciding with the launch imminently, or this week, so it'll be online shortly on our website, of our latest Woodwise magazine. So this is our science magazine. We publish this twice a year. Yeah, and this edition is all around the nature positive economy. So do check that out. Okay, we've got some. Okay, so okay, I'll go back to the poll. Bear with me as I switch slides. Great, keep them coming. Okay, so we've got some fresh, exciting, healthy, some very positive words there. A bit of risk, yeah, okay. That's great. Yeah, ultimately sustainable. I think that's key. Great, keep those coming in and we will, yeah, come back to that. If you bear with me while I reshare my screen. Yeah, so the Woodland Trust, why did we want to do a whole edition on nature positive economy? This is rapidly, this language is rapidly gaining traction in policy and practice circles. It's potentially transformational, but it also needs much thought and nuance to do it right. So we've got 7 excellent contributions from experts across academia, policy, law, business and practice as well in forestry and agriculture. So do check that out. Hopefully there's lots of food for thought in there. But I'm joined today by 2 of our expert contributors to that. Ruth Waters from Natural England, who will share more around the science behind this concept, and then Sam Sinclair on how we translate some of this to businesses. So first, just to set the scene before I hand over to them, I wanted to share where this concept is coming from, why it matters, and then some perspectives as well on what it needs to mean. So really this language has fast grown over the last couple of years, largely in the build up to COP15, culminating in the global biodiversity framework last December. So interestingly, nature positive language was actually dropped in the final agreement, but it's absolutely gained traction. So we've certainly seen governments, policymakers, standard setters using this language. We're also seeing organizations, so individual companies, universities, NGOs, starting to frame nature positive strategy. So this language is very much here. The question is, how does it best serve nature, and how do we all best work together to respond? So why does this matter? I'm going to assume you're all ecologists or have some basis in ecology for joining this webinar. So I'm not going to depress you with all the statistics on the state of global biodiversity loss. I'm going to assume that we know that general picture of decline. So we know that we need to work rapidly to bend the curve on this biodiversity loss. What's really clear is it's not enough just to do business as usual. We absolutely need to unlock more money, more investment in nature, but that is also not enough. You know, if it's not enough, we could danger of 1 step forward, 10 steps back if we throw some money at conservation, but meanwhile continue to do really polluting activity. So the fundamental challenge is we need to learn how to produce and consume ultimately in harmony with nature, in a way that respects nature. You could say within planetary boundaries. That's the ultimate challenge. I think Sam might go more into some of the drivers here, but on the flip side, why does this matter to the economy? The short answer is there's no business on a dead planet. Nature loss is increasingly considered a material business risk to business and the economy. So it's fast rising up the risk agenda. Point of this slide, I won't go into the detail. The point is this matters. There is a real material driver now for action on nature. So when we think about what is a nature positive economy then, and I should say it's undefined, there are lots of discussions, lots of ambitions, targets being thrown around at the moment and we need more discussion really on what it means. And I think it's helpful to think about two key framings when we think about what does nature positive conduct, what does it mean, right? One is from the kind of whole biosphere health lens. And I really like the planetary boundaries model. If you're not aware of this, I highly recommend you take a look at this from the Stockholm Resilience Centre. I won't go into too much detail on this now, but basically they've come up with 9 Earth systems, right, which we can't afford to risk overshooting tipping points. That's the concept. It's identifying planetary tipping points, basically. Clearly, we have a well-established tipping point for climate change. As ecologists, we know that the issue is much wider than climate, but I think that's a helpful model to think about. So one challenge is, what does business, production, consumption, investment look like within, safely within those planetary systems? The other perspective is more from the organization. So for that business, or university, or whatever, thinking around, okay, well, what might it mean for us to be nature positive? Yes, it's looking at what we can do in our control, so our direct sites, our headquarters, our production sites and whatever, but also that's not enough. It's also looking at what we call the value chain, which is everything from your sourcing, your supply chain, through to how customers use and dispose of products. But that's not enough either. It's also looking at the wider landscapes and the wider systems that a business might be influencing on, right, having an impact or dependency on. So I'm starting with those very different perspectives, but I hope that gives a bit of framing about how organizations might start to grapple with what nature positive might mean. And at this point, you might also be thinking, hang on, nature's really complex. It doesn't really work to have a simple target and in one simple, planetary dot like that. And clearly nature is inherently local. It's very complex. It's all interconnected. We can't just, it's not fungible, right? We can't just simply interchange it like we can with carbon, say. So there's a real challenge here in working out, when we're talking about nature positive for whom, according to who, for what, right? Whose services does it, whose purposes does it serve? So these are some really tricky questions that certainly Woodwise looks at when it explores different value, different ways of valuing nature and different valuing paradigms, which I think are really important. But a fundamental challenge is how we translate all the complexities of nature into a way to have an overarching nature positive moonshot, if you like, across that, but then integrate that into the way that us humans actually manage, our systems in different ways. So there's a real challenge of this management, basically, the breakdown interpretation management, which is where a lot of the complexity lies. Just to expand, I think it's easy to get very lost in the complexity of that. So my proposition is increasingly that, what we need to shift away from, or we need to build organizational legibility, if you like, literacy, ecological literacy. So the way businesses often think, and this is certainly true from carbon management, they think around, let's green our, scope 1, that's from carbon language. So let's green our direct sites, right? Our headquarters, right? Our factories, and maybe let's green our customer bases and our supply bases. That's not how nature works. If you're greening a few sites here without thinking about those ecological connections, all those intricacies, then that doesn't serve nature at all. So what we really need to do is build wider, maybe landscape literacy, and build more of a case for businesses to be investing in the health, say, of wider water catchments, ecological networks, buffering and extending around existing nature, basically, rather than just focusing on quite narrow, their individual sites. So that's one thought to put out there. The other key thing when we're thinking about nature positive, as I say, it's not fungible. It's not like carbon. We can't just balance it on a spreadsheet. It's absolutely fundamental that we are following the mitigation hierarchy and always working with existing nature. Given the stakes of global biodiversity loss, we must, this is a non-negotiable, we must always protect irreplaceable habitats like, rainforests, ancient woods and trees, other really important sites. we must, we must stop unacceptable and unacceptable and frankly unnecessary activity. Then being pragmatic, it's then about reducing harm as much as we can. There's always going to be a little bit of residual harm. Ultimately, we live, we breathe, right? But it's reducing that harm as much as we can. Then it's about greening activity as much as we can. So embedding nature throughout production processes as much as we can. So for example, more green infrastructure, embedding trees on farms, maybe in food systems, things like that. Also investing beyond your production systems, beyond your value chain, to think about how entities can support nature positive visions in wider society. And then, and only at this point, might we consider the role of credits. We cannot use offsets before we're doing any of this. This mitigation hierarchy piece is absolutely key. So before I hand over to Ruth, I just wanted to take us back to the poll. It's interesting. So thank you so much for all your answers. We've had 94 answers. Yeah, so yeah, sustainability, circular, it's really interesting, regenerative. Yeah, so some really exciting transformative language there. Some concern as well, overdue. That's interesting. So thank you so much. That's really insightful. And I will hand over now to Ruth.
Thanks very much, Heather. So let me get myself set up. Go. There we go. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the evidence behind nature recovery to support the economy. And to kick off, I just thought I'd say a little bit more about the relationship between nature, biodiversity and the economy, because it's really critical for a key fact later on. So, of course, nature is made up of a whole range of ecosystems, which are the interactions between the living and non-living elements of the natural environment. They operate best when they've got their full complement of biodiversity, or that they've got their integrity. And when they're in that space and they're functioning properly, they are productive, they're resilient, and they're adaptable. And they can provide us with a whole range of benefits or ecosystem goods and services, which in turn contribute to our produced goods, our human capital and welfare and the economy. But one of the critical things about these ecosystems is that the ecosystem functions and processes within them are often irreplaceable, and we can't substitute them for technology. So we are reliant on nature to continue to gain the benefits that we get from ecosystems. So if we've identified this important relationship between nature, biodiversity and the economy, why have we still got this problem with nature degradation? Well, mostly the value of nature is missing from a whole wide range of decisions. And because of that, it's actually valued as zero. We just take it for granted. And this has led to all the declines that we're so familiar with. And this extent now of biodiversity loss and nature's loss is really undermining that productivity, resilience and adaptability that I talked about, and is fueling significant risk and uncertainty for our economies and well-being. So, for example, it's leading us to worry about tipping points in places like the Amazon, where if we move from one stable state of the Amazon now to another stable state, but less productive, it's got really high implications for the water cycle and for climate change globally. And the other thing we'll lose is opportunities as well if we get more biodiversity loss. For example, 70% of the drugs that we use for cancer are derived from nature or are produced from nature itself. So we lose a lot of opportunities as well. So it's really important that we try and address this. So in 2019, the Treasury actually commissioned an independent global review on the economics of biodiversity to try to get to the bottom of this relationship. And this was led by Professor Siddhartha Dasgupta, Professor in Economics from Cambridge University. And he went back to first principles, both from an economic perspective, but also really interesting from an ecological perspective, to bring those two disciplines together to understand what's going on. And he's come up with a comprehensive economic framework, the first of its kind really, to build these together, and has called for a change in the way that we undertake mainstream economics and transformative change in the way we manage and make decisions about nature. And that you can look this review up. There's 3 different versions: a big fat 600-page one, one that's slimmer, which is about 60 pages, which is well worth a read, and one about 4 sides. So there's an option for everybody there. So just look it up on the web if you're interested. So what are some of the key findings from the Dasgupta review? Well, one of the key findings is that our demands on nature have far exceeded its capacity to be able to provide us with the goods and services on which we rely. And so if you look at this, what's called an impact inequality equation, what's happening on one side is we've got humanity's demand, which is the population, the amount that we extract from nature, and the waste that we put back in. And on the other side, we've got the stock of nature itself and its ability to regenerate. And what the review found, that for decades now, we have been exceeding the demand over the supply, which is causing a lot of the problems that we're seeing. And so with this view of demand and supply, this inequality, and also that message I've said earlier about the ecosystem functions and processes being irreplaceable with alternative technology, the review concludes that actually the economy is embedded in nature. The economy is a subsidiary of nature itself. And in effect, it's limited because it cannot break free from these functions and processes within the system that nothing else can do. So accepting that the economy is bounded by the biosphere really changes the way that we need to view and apply economics and decision-making across the world, as well as in the UK. And the review came up with 12 broad recommendations. It asked us to change the way we think, the way we act, and the way we measure to enable us to have a sustainable relationship with nature and the economy. And this diagram pulls out those 12 things. They're based across 3 areas. One is around balancing that equation I showed you, so an increase in nature's supply. So we've got things like conserving and restoring natural assets, better management of land and sea to benefit people and nature, and issues around supply chains and producing less waste. So that's really trying to look after our stocks. The second key area was around changing our measures of economic success. So we can do that by including natural capital accounting in a lot of decisions. We can include nature in our productivity measures. And importantly, we can have a different measure of success as a society, something called inclusive wealth, where we do include nature as natural capital in that mix. And the final key area that we looked at was around transforming our institutions and systems, a really important area. And this includes anything from empowering citizens to make informed choices, through to a review and change of our global financial systems so they support nature. So there's more information you can find, but some key critical things there. So I wanted to go on to say a bit more about what we've been doing in the UK and also in England as well. So coming back to that issue of measures and being able to measure natural capital and include it in our decisions. Within England, we've set up something called the Natural Capital and Ecosystem Programme. There's both a terrestrial and a marine version. And in the terrestrial version, what we're doing over the next couple of years is actually setting out a baseline of the quantity and quality of our ecosystems across the whole of England, so that this systematic data can be included in a whole range of decisions. And this is a partnership between DEFRA and a range of the agencies, including Natural England themselves. And if you're interested to find out more about this, you can look up the NCEA on the website, and you can see some of the early products that have been coming out from this exciting programme. And so what else has been going on? Well, Heather talked about the Convention on Biological Diversity, and this is really trying to address, in those economic terms that I described earlier, our stocks. How can we conserve and increase our stocks of nature? And the CBD set out an agreement that 30% of terrestrial freshwater and marine areas are effectively conserved and managed for all those things that are important: biodiversity, the ecosystem functions, the services, its integrity and connectivity. And this does seem very high. It's aspirational in some sense, but actually we know from global studies that this is entirely achievable. We know that we can still have a growing population and feed that growing population with 30% of protected land if we mitigate some of the issues through reducing our waste and moving to more plant-based diets. We also know that there can be net benefits from this approach across a number of sectors and actually be increased economic value from doing this. But we also know that we have to act quickly. A study that looked at this found that delaying by 10 years increases the cost significantly and reduces the feasibility. So we do need to crack on and act quickly. And in the UK, we have committed to protecting 30% of land and sea by 2030. And what that looks like roughly across the UK is we've got about 36% of marine areas in marine protected areas, and there's around 28% of terrestrial areas in some form of protection. And that actually turns into about 10.5% if we think of the protection as sites of special scientific interest or the equivalent in Northern Ireland, for example. And there are discussions going on about, what actually does really count within this 30% and what doesn't in government at the moment. So more to see, but really great to see that we've made the commitment. And in England, of course, we also have the Environment Act, which has set out 11 legally binding targets. So this is the first time really we've had legally binding targets like this, and they're there to support and ensure we achieve the goals of our environmental improvement plan. And they include things like halting the decline of species abundance and improving that over time, reducing species extinction risk, and restoring or creating in excess of 500,000 hectares of wildlife-rich habitat outside of those protected sites. So really good news. And from a tree perspective, it's increasing tree canopy and woodland cover from 14 to 16.5% in England by 2050. So some really positive moves there. And so what does this mean from a wood and trees perspective? Well, there's ongoing opportunities and increasing opportunities for woods and trees to provide nature-based solutions and improve the condition of woods to boost carbon storage and nature recovery. And we need to create mixed woodlands with multifunctional uses in the right place that support nature and deliver a range of products and ecosystem services. And as Heather said earlier, in the Woodwise magazine, there's lots of examples of some really positive contributions that we can make to a nature positive economy. And also in reports such as this one on your screen, which was produced by JNCC, lots of examples across the UK of really good nature recovery projects supporting people and nature that we can mainstream and roll out more actively across the UK. Some really positive news there. So that's all I wanted to say for the moment. Thanks very much. So I think I'm handing over.
Grand, that's my cue, I believe. I will. Good afternoon, folks. I'm Sam Sinclair. I'm one of the directors of Biodiversity, and we're a consultancy that helps companies develop corporate biodiversity strategies, and we do landscape level plans for nature as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of businesses in a nature positive economy. So first off, I just thought I'd bring in a bit of the international context. So a huge amount has been happening in legislation and policies and frameworks, all kinds of things in the last little while. So the Environment Act, obviously, rather dramatically passed in the UK in November 2021. The Science-Based Targets for Nature, which is an effort to create a standardized way of setting targets for a company's impact on biodiversity and how to ameliorate them. They started out their interim guidance in October last year, and actually we've just started working on the actual pilots, literally launched like this month. We're working with Caring and a few other companies to actually figure out how you actually do this. Around the same time, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures started some pilots in October, and that was an effort. That's an effort to create a standardised way of understanding a company's impacts on biodiversity and nature, so that investors can understand what they're buying into, basically. There's also been the launch of the Nature Benchmark by the World Benchmarking Alliance. Obviously, very excitingly, the CBD adopted the Global Biodiversity Framework. And in Europe, we've also had the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive passed, which sounds very severe, but is really, really interesting. It's about creating a way of forcing companies to disclose on their sustainability efforts, which includes biodiversity, in a way to kind of level the playing field and basically prevent people from greenwashing, because you'll be able to actually look it up, basically. So a lot of momentum is building up very quickly, which is really interesting. One of the challenges is that the biodiversity is quite hard. It's quite a lot harder than some of the other things we've done. And there's a number of reasons for this. The first one is there's no fungible unit of biodiversity. So carbon is unified by the fact you've got tons of carbon, this single metric that works anywhere in the world. A ton of carbon in Australia is worth a ton of carbon in Kent. That simply isn't possible for biodiversity. There's never really going to be a universal metric or unit, which makes the whole endeavour slightly harder. Linked to this, kind of slightly the same thing, phrased in a different way really, biodiversity action has to be contextually specific. Planting an oak tree where I live would be a great thing to do. Planting it in Australia would be a terrible thing to do. Planting it in wetlands in England would also be a terrible thing to do. So you've got to really tailor biodiversity action to the local context in a way that you don't necessarily have to do for other aspects of sustainability. You know, removing pollution or avoiding plastic pollution is generally a good thing to do pretty much everywhere you are. There's also a lot of contextual factors which make it tricky. One of my favourite ones, one of the ones I work on the most, is the fact that stakeholders often have really important views about biodiversity in the area. Nature is almost always local to someone, and people in those areas care about it, both from a personal perspective, but also because they depend upon it for water, pollinators, soil organic content, all these other kinds of things that are really critical to our businesses. These things combined means addressing biodiversity impacts requires high supply chain transparency. You've really got to understand where your materials are coming from. If you're using cotton or beef or leather or wood or whatever it might be, those products can all be produced in a huge range of different ways. On one end of the spectrum, they could be fairly sustainably produced. On the other end, they might be highly impactful on biodiversity. And actually, it's very, very challenging for companies to develop this transparency in their supply chain to really understand how is their stuff being produced and what can they do about it? How can they lean on their suppliers to try and change the system that we all live within so that actually we start to produce things in a way that doesn't have an impact on biodiversity? It's very much a collaborative effort will be required, as well as a huge amount of data. There are some opportunities, though, that are particularly exciting about this whole nature positive thing. The first is that biodiversity provides us with a huge range of benefits. I've listed some there: flood and drought mitigation, pollination, public health. And this is quite different to carbon. I feel like the main benefit that carbon provides us with, or carbon efforts, is not dying horribly, which is not specifically useful to most businesses, other than in the broader sense, whereas often most businesses are to some degree or other depending on biodiversity, and in some cases really quite extremely. We work with people who make cotton clothes, for example. A lot of them are sourcing their cotton from India, which produces I think 24% of the world's cotton, and is really vulnerable to climate change. One of the main things they can do to make it resilient to climate change and still be producing cotton t-shirts and jeans and things is put nature across those landscapes so that it's actually able to resist the droughts and floods brought by weather extremes. The other thing is that personal connections to nature are really strong. Like I said, I struggle to connect with a carbon. I've never really seen one before in my life. And other than the kind of general sense of terror and dread, I don't have that much of a strong connection with them. Whereas I care really quite intensely about the nature in my area, the nature that I see, the nature that I've experienced in my life and have seen on the TV screen. And that personal connection is really powerful because it's really consistent. That's not just me. That's actually a shared part of the human experience in many ways. And certainly some of our clients are actually saying part of the reason they want to work with us is that their staff really care about nature, and it's a huge benefit for them to show that they're actually a company that genuinely is trying to do something, because then it means they get the best staff who really care about what they're doing. Which is a huge deal from a corporate perspective. Many businesses compete with each other largely through stealing each other's staff, basically. I'm also going to touch on biodiversity net gain briefly, because this is kind of the sharp end of all this in many ways. I'm sure most of you will know that in England, as of November, you'll have to achieve 10% biodiversity net gain in any development. And this is quite interesting, really, because achieving this is going to require cooperation between many different types of actors. Architects, developers, ecologists, local authorities, all these kinds of people. And it's quite complicated. And one of the challenges here is that developers and all these other players are now going to have to incorporate biodiversity in their decision making in a far more systematic way. It's going to have to come in far earlier because it's going to be really quite significant. If they have to go out and buy a bunch of credits at the most basic level, that's going to cost them a lot of money. But actually, ideally, we'd like them to not be doing that. We'd like them to actually be thinking about it well in advance. Now, the challenge here is there isn't a single data set for biodiversity, but rather multiple different data sets, all of which disagree with each other in various different ways. And mostly, you need to have a trained ecologist to help you interpret them. Certainly, as a social scientist, I am well out of my depth compared to some of my teammates working on this sort of stuff. So something that we've done is developed a tool that helps to convert this information to decision-ready outputs. And this is kind of an exciting new thing for us, really, but it's part of a broader effort to try and, I think it's really important, to try and take this complexity and boil it down to something that someone who's making a choice can actually use. Someone who's making an important decision, often for a business that impacts nature, can quickly get their head around and understand, right, okay, this is what this means for me. This is how I can make a better choice as an actor within the private sector. So I'm going to very quickly run you through how it works because part of its strength is that it's simple in what you see, but the complexity is all the significant amount of effort going into the analysis behind it. So the first thing is people can use an interactive map to discover where the habitats and designated sites in their area are and figure out what might there be in terms of biodiversity around areas they're considering building. They can then put in their development sites into the tool. We've made this super simple. They can literally go and click on it and just kind of highlight the area, or they can upload a shapefile if they're more technically savvy, which is certainly the case for many developers and their consultants and things. The tool then runs a detailed analysis to estimate the value for nature for each development site. It goes through all these different habitat types, deals with the inconsistencies and the complexities and uncertainties, and pulls out, essentially identifies how much habitat is there, how much habitat is likely to be in the place where someone's considering building something. Also pulls out some other things like P into nature and woodland, which are not technically dealt with in the biodiversity metric because they're so important that actually you can't really offset them in the way that you might be able to do other habitats. And it crunches all this down and spits out an answer in biodiversity units, which is the crux of the Environment Act in this regard. Your impact is calculated using natural England's biodiversity metrics. Sorry, very aware that I have some from Natural England on the call, so I should definitely get that citation correct. So you get the score spat out at the end. And this then basically gets sent to the user in an email along with separate CSVs, which I don't know what that stands for, but something to do with the data and shapefiles containing the data, which allows them to very quickly, in a really simple report, understand, right, is building here going to be a really good idea or a really bad idea from a biodiversity perspective, or is there likely biodiversity net gain implication of building there? And it's not a be-all and end-all. They'll need to have consultants and ecologists and all these other people go out and check this stuff. But the intention is that this allows them to think about their biodiversity impacts really early on in the process, so that suddenly those barriers to data entry, the barriers to kind of thinking about these really complicated topics are lowered, hopefully then allowing them to make better choices, basically, and be far more conscious of the relationship they have with biodiversity in their development and in their business operations more broadly. It's live, bngscreentool.com. You can go in there and have a go. And if you ask me nicely in email, I'll probably give you a discount code. And we're super interested in getting feedback from people. It's very much a labor of love, this tool, and we're developing it very actively with people. So we're really keen to have feedback from people in terms of what they like about it, what they don't, and also what else we could do, because we've got quite a few other things on the back burner, and we're trying to kind of figure out which ones we should do first. Thank you very much. I think we're doing questions now, aren't we?
Yes, thanks so much, Sam and Ruth and Heather, for those talks. Yeah, well, we've got time for questions now. And thanks everyone who's put your questions in the chat. Keep them coming. Whilst you're kind of catching your breath after your presentation, I just wanted to thank all of our authors for this issue of Woodwise. So just a very quick run through, and also just to give you an oversight of the other articles that we've not mentioned. Obviously, Sam and Ruth have done a great job of summarising their contributions, which has been really valued, and we really appreciate your contributions to this issue of our conservation science and practice magazine, Woodwise. But just to thank a few other contributors. There's an article on the multiple values we associate with nature and nature positive by Jasper Kenter, Mike Christie, and Hewell Griffiths from Aberystwyth University. There's an article on the role of law in nature positive economy, which is from James Cameron, who's a barrister and a leading voice and leading kind of climate change authority. There's an article on the role of financial services, things like insurance, etc., from Zelda Bentham from Aviva, which is really interesting. And obviously we've heard from Sam and Ruth, which are fantastic on their articles. And then, yeah, on the kind of practical side of things as well, we've got the role of trees on farms and agroforestry from Vicky Hurd, who's head of sustainable farming at Sustain. And finally, we've got what does nature positive forestry look like? What does the nature positive forestry sector look like? From Ellie Tew, Neil Riddle, and Andrew Stringer at Forestry England. So a lot of bases covered. So just hopefully that whets your appetite for this issue of Woodwise. And we will, yes, I've just seen the most latest question from Hill is whether we'll link the articles. We'll add that link in again to the chat, and it will be coming very quickly. It's imminently going to be on the website. Right, so let's get down to some questions.
I can see some in there about the tool already.
Yeah, lots about the tool, Sam. Do you want to kick off about that? We can.
Yeah, sure.
That'd be interesting. Yeah, so let's see what. So one of them was about whether the tool quantifies the quality of biodiversity. That was interesting to me because I'm very interested in how we, how we value biodiversity. And you mentioned also how there's no unified metric, but there's obviously a big. We often get at the Woodland Trust kind of, we want to do good monitoring of the impact of our work. So, and it's kind of quite hard sometimes. It's a bit too reductionist sometimes, isn't it, to kind of boil it down to a number. So I don't know what you think about quality and that kind of concept.
So this is strictly focused on the legislation. So it values it in terms of it doesn't actually value it at all. It tells you how many biodiversity metrics you would incur in terms of metric units, in terms of the Natural England tool metric. Calculator, if you remove the habitat there. So it's very much focusing on the legislation and what the implications would be in terms of kind of complying with that legislation. And this is, I also feel quite strongly about not valuing nature, but there's a huge amount of effort that's gone into this and still goes on into this calculator that I think is quite incredible how much work's gone into that. So this is very much about helping people understand what the implications would be with regards to that. So we're kind of not really bringing value judgments to this. We're trying to make it specifically about compliance with the Environment Act.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. I also noticed an interesting question about whether the tool considers species as well as habitats, and if it's purely terrestrial, whether it also considers marine and coastal habitats, just whilst we're on the tool, and then we'll move on to other questions.
Sure. So this is a really good question. So the problem with species data in the UK is that we have no idea what the search effort is. So we have all these spots where people have seen a species, but we've no idea if that's because there's lots of that species there, or if there's just a super enthusiastic birder who's been very dedicated in submitting species record collection, the data to people who compile this stuff, which is really hard because then it's really difficult to use that data effectively. So what Biodiversify are doing is funding a PhD student to basically spend 3.5 years of their life figuring out how to translate this data into something that we actually could use in something like this tool. And I know certainly that we're not the only people thinking about this. There's a lot of people thinking about this, but that's kind of our small effort in this larger, really quite significant national problem. We're not doing, I think we do coastal habitats, but we're not doing marine ones at the moment. However, Dr. Julia Hayward, who is a lot of the kind of genius behind the tool, has a marine background. So it's very high on our priority list. And I certainly know it's something that Julia and also Dr. Mike Burgess, my other director, think about very passionately.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. And so just to sort of maybe aim a question at Ruth, there were a couple that I think came in during your talk, Ruth, but I suppose just to sort of zoom out a bit, I'm interested in the kind of the legacy, or your view of the legacy of the Dasgupta review. Obviously, it was a very well publicized report, and I think when you get those big reports that have someone's name in the title, they kind of can have quite long shelf lives. Like, I'm thinking about the Lawton review as well. We still talk about that, and that's had a big impact across policy and practice. So I'd just be interested in your sort of view about the kind of legacy of the Dasgupta review to date and in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a bit like the Stern, the Stern report as well. That's another one with a long legacy. And I think the Dasgupta review will have a long legacy because, it's actually about Arthur took it back to core economics, actually. So there are, for those of you who would like to read the long version or an economist, if there's any of you on there are some chapters that are, really deep economics, explaining why nature really needs to be incorporated in the way that we do mainstream economics. And we've had students actually doing economics at university that say this is like a textbook in a way for them, to take away and reframe the application. So there's lots of good stuff in economics. It's just that often there's this assumption that we can either break free from nature or we don't need to include it at all, and that's the paradigm shift that I think we need. Because if they change the way, and I see there's another question about a paradigm shift in the chat, if we do get nature to be included in the way that we apply mainstream economics, then the way the Treasury, for example, would work would be quite different. They'd be wanting information not just on budgets. They'd be wanting information on the state of our natural capital. Is it improving, is it declining, because that's got material consideration on our economics. So I think, that's the long legacy, and different bits of it are being picked up in different ways. And that natural capital ecosystem assessment that I talked about is one example of where we're trying to really fill the gaps, with some data, systematic data that can be included properly in decision making.
Yeah, fascinating. You mentioned that question about the paradigm shift, so we might as well go to that one. That's an interesting one. Which the question is from Humphrey Crick. Hi, Humphrey. And it's what are the implications of a nature-based economy for the prevailing economic paradigm of economic growth? A big question, really.
I think there's been lots of discussions actually, and around how we measure economic success. So at the moment it's very much around GDP, which is a really useful measure for short run things we can measure in short term. What's happening is do we have growth, but how's that working? But actually it's not so useful for long-term views. And the way that the Dasgupta review suggests is we should use something called inclusive wealth, which brings together human capital, natural capital, and produced capital. Largely at the moment we're looking at production, and to some extent human, but natural capital's not in there at all. So if you take that approach, you'd get a much better understanding about how each of those bits of our economy, if you like, the core underpinning bits of our economy, is performing. And what the review found was actually that we've had economic growth, but that has been at the expense of nature. And given what we know about nature being essential for the economy, that's actually not very good management of our assets. Under any other perspective, you'd look after your assets so you continue to get the benefits out of them, and you'd invest in them, and you'd maintain them. And that's the kind of paradigm shift that I think we need to see, that recognition of our stock of nature being so critical and something that we need to monitor and invest in.
Definitely. And I think, I can't remember the exact figure. I can't remember where I read it, which isn't great, about the number of Earths we're currently using for our currently, I think it's something like 2.5 Earths.
It keeps going up, unfortunately.
So which is just an insane and a very kind of stark way of putting it for me personally, anyway. Heather, I wanted to bring you in because we've talked a bit about irreplaceable habitats, and I think that Sam actually mentioned it in the context of biodiversity net gain, and they don't even irreplaceable habitats, like ancient woods and trees, the ones that have this kind of such long continuity of value for wildlife. I don't, hard or impossible even to factor into those kind of calculations, and it becomes kind of meaningless. I don't know, Heather, if you kind of it might be a new concept to people, this idea that things are actually irreplaceable in nature, because we think of it as a kind of dynamic turnover, and we think about evolution. So I don't know if you kind of wanted to dwell on that a bit, Heather.
That's interesting. Yeah, of course, because living things evolve, aren't they? And that's probably the bigger point, is that we need to when we're looking at nature positive economy concepts, or economic concepts, and clearly it's really important as a management tool, it's really important we're led by science, ecological science, using these accounting management tools as a tool, but not being led by the accounting. The reason I say that is we need to learn how to work with uncertainty and dynamism and change, and the reality that climate change is happening, climate change is exacerbating nature loss, etc. Like, we need to, so really what we need to do is build resilience. I might be slightly changing your question, but I think you're right, it's not about getting stuck on this static definition on that plot of land over there is irreplaceable, but it's about understanding we need to if we want to work with uncertainty and an increasingly uncertain environmental world, we need to build resilience, basically, to the impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, and all of those exacerbating factors. Which means safeguarding our existing habitats, making them as strong, as resilient as possible, by looking at that whole ecological system lens. Ecosystem lens. It's not directly answering your question.
I think
to get dynamism in there.
The idea about it being a system that's irreplaceable, then you can't replicate all of those unique interactions that have evolved over time. That's kind of a really kind of key part of it. The idea I think that we touched upon is the word that I've never known how to pronounce, that the fungible word, about nature being non-fungible as well. That comes into the kind of irreplaceability of the kind of inherent value of nature, which is fascinating.
Yeah. And if I know you're chatting, but if I can just use that to jump on to one of the other questions that came in around a business with low impact on direct control and operations, where to start. And I think just building on that idea of use the accounting stuff as a tool, but be led by the science. I think it's a case of take a step back, look at your common sense. Where really are your impacts and dependencies? And that might mean areas that aren't captured by natural capital accounting tools, right? For example, your biggest impact might be influence, actually. How you can influence your customers, your staff. Maybe it's about government lobbying. So be creative and think about where your biggest impacts and dependencies actually are. It might not be something that you can necessarily claim on a balance sheet necessarily, just be led by the science. And it's about how do we collectively build resilience ultimately for a safer future world for all of us.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, okay, so there's a question here that I think just anyone can jump in on, depending on if the spirit moves you. So given the domination of sustainability and carbon thinking in ecological and economic discourse, can you point to specific cases that might help communicate the distinction, I think, with nature positive economy to others regarding the kind of conservation and biodiversity? Do you know what immediately comes to mind in that kind of sense?
I can start. So I think some really simple concepts to hold on to, which we've already discussed. Nature's not fungible. Nature's inherently local. You can't exchange it. It's complex. So I think that working with the mitigation hierarchy, always working with existing nature, is really key. There's really important lessons to learn from carbon, and maybe Sam might want to share some reflections on your work with businesses. So some really important lessons, but it's different fundamentally. It's complex. Mitigation hierarchy.
Anyone else have any thoughts to add to that?
I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure I answered the question.
Okay, well, let's move on then. That's we are actually, we're coming to the end of our time anyway, so I'm just about to share a link to the back issues of Woodwise, and via that same link, this latest Nature Positive Economy Woodwise will be there very shortly, so please do check it out. Also, just a huge thanks to someone who's you can't see today, but who is kind of instrumental to producing our conservation practice and conservation mag Woodwise, who is Karen Hornigold. Thanks so much to Karen, the editor of Woodwise. It wouldn't happen without her, so thank you to Karen. I'll share my screen again just to sort of have a few wrap-up slides, but before I do, thanks so much to Ruth and Sam and Heather for taking the time today to present at this AER live webinar, but also for contributing to Woodwise. It's been really fantastic working with you, so thank you. I think the issue has really carved out a niche for itself in terms of hopefully being a kind of go-to accessible resource for on the topic. So we're really proud of that. You know, we really tried to collate evidence from experts on a whole range of topics for Woodwise. So thanks you for contributing to that. Just to flag the next AER live webinar as well, which is next month. It's led by Dario Hipólto, an early career researcher who's going to be sharing his experience on how best to engage and work together with local communities when practicing in situ conservation. And I believe there will be wolves, which is exciting. Hopefully that's a good enough reason to join a webinar. Registration is now open for that, and you can find out more on the AER website. And yeah, just another reminder about our symposium, the Woodland Trust Symposium, in collaboration with the University of Kent and British Ecological Society, and you've got until tomorrow at 5 p.m. to UK time to register for that. So please do. It's in Kent. It's going to be a fantastic event towards the end of June. We've announced the plenary speakers for that, so do check out the website and join us. And also just to flag again our sponsor. A final thanks to today's sponsors, Wildlife Acoustics. In addition to creating bioacoustics research tools, they offer free online resources as well for professionals, so including product training, webinars. If you've not had enough of webinars, then some more from Wildlife Acoustics. So check out those resources at wildlifeacoustics.com/resources. So finally, a huge thanks again to everyone for joining us for this webinar, and hopefully see you again at the symposium or at next month's AER live webinar. So thanks very much, everyone.